CENTCOM and the rest of the Joint Force remain ready to resume major combat operations against Iran if ordered to do so. No adversary should mistake our current restraint with a lack of resolve.
Chief said Iranian missile, drones, and small boat attacks on U.S. forces in the Strait yesterday were successfully defended.
The aircraft carrier was already on fire when the first report reached Bahrain. That is what the initial Intercept suggested. A burst of Iranian military traffic, partially decoded, referencing flames and a large vessel and the name Eisenhower, all within the span of 90 seconds. The watch officer at Naval Support Activity Bahrain read the fragments, looked at the position data he already had on the Eisenhower strike group, and felt his stomach drop before his training caught up with his instincts. He reached for the secure line. He did not get to finish the call before the correction came through on the American side. The Eisenhower was not on fire. The Eisenhower was fine. What was on fire was everything around it. The confusion in that initial Iranian communication tells you something important about what the morning looked like from the other side. From the Iranian perspective, in those first chaotic minutes, the operation was executing. Boats were in the water. Formations were holding. Speedboats were closing on the largest warship in the Persian Gulf at combined approach speeds that left almost no time for anything except commitment. And then things started burning that were not supposed to burn, and the reports coming back up the chain stopped matching the plan, and the people listening to those reports on the northern shore had to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had spent years expecting to hear. The disconnect between those two things is the entire story. But the story does not start in the water. It starts in a room. 14 months before a single boat engine turned over on the morning of the engagement, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy conducted a tabletop exercise at a facility in Bandar Abbas that American intelligence was aware of but could not observe directly. What they knew came later, pieced together from signals intercepts, defector debriefings, and the kind of slow, unglamorous analysis that never makes it into headlines. The exercise modeled an attack on a transiting carrier strike group at the narrowest section of the Strait of Hormuz using massed small craft formations supported by coordinated shore-based anti-ship missile fire. The scenario was not new. The IRGC had been running variations of it since the late 1990s. What was new, according to the best reconstruction available, was the scale. Previous exercises modeled 20 to 30 boats. This one modeled over 50. The logic behind the increase was not arbitrary. It was responsive. The IRGC had watched American defensive capabilities evolve in real time for decades. They had watched the introduction of the Cooperative Engagement Capability, which allowed ships in a strike group to share targeting data seamlessly and engage threats using another ship's sensors. They had watched the integration of the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, which gave the carrier group an airborne radar picture so detailed it could track individual jet ski wakes at distances that made the old E-2C look like it was working with a flashlight. They had watched the Navy quietly increase the rate of fire and engagement envelope of the Phalanx close-in weapon system, add SeaRAM launchers to escort vessels, and drill its helicopter crews on surface interdiction until the Seahawk became less of a utility platform and more of a weapon system that happened to fly. Every one of those upgrades had been noted. Every one of them had been modeled. And the IRGC's answer to all of them was the same answer it had always given, just louder. More boats. Faster coordination. Tighter approach windows. If the Americans could now handle 30 contacts simultaneously, the plan would give them 52. If the defensive envelope had expanded, the attack would start closer. If the helicopters were more lethal, the boats would carry more crew-served weapons pointed upward. The IRGC was not ignoring the evolution of American capabilities. It was trying to outpace it with volume. The 52 boats that entered the water on the morning of the engagement were not a random collection of hulls. They were organized into 5 distinct elements, each with a specific function, each crewed by men who had rehearsed their particular role until muscle memory replaced decision-making. The outermost ring, roughly 18 boats, was the distraction layer. These were the fastest hulls in the formation, Swedish-designed Bagamar-type craft and their Iranian-built descendants, capable of sustained speeds above 45 knots, armed with heavy machine guns and in some cases rocket launchers that were more psychological than practical at the ranges they would be operating. Their job was not to hit anything. Their job was to be everywhere, to force every radar operator on every American ship to devote attention and tracking resources to contacts that were never going to close within weapons range of the carrier. Inside that ring, a second layer of 14 boats carried a mix of weapons that made them genuinely dangerous, but not in the way the Americans were most worried about. These were the boats with the machine guns, the recoilless rifles, the occasional Chinese-made anti-tank guided missile adapted for maritime use. They were slower, heavier, and they knew their function was to absorb defensive fire. The men on those boats understood the math. If the American escorts were shooting at them, The escorts were not shooting at the next layer inward. Every second of defensive attention they consumed was a second purchased for someone else. The innermost group was 11 boats. These were the ones carrying the mission. 3 of them had been modified to carry C-701 anti-ship missiles, small, short-range, radar-guided weapons that were not going to sink a Nimitz-class carrier but absolutely could damage flight deck equipment, destroy parked aircraft, or kill enough exposed personnel to turn a combat-capable vessel into a floating emergency room. The remaining 8 carried shape-charge warheads packed into the bows of modified Boston whaler-style hulls that the IRGC had been producing domestically for years. These were not suicide boats in the way the term is commonly understood. They were optionally manned. The crews had the ability to arm the charges, point the boats, and bail out at the last moment. Whether that option was realistic at the approach speeds the plan required is a question the plan's designers almost certainly did not answer honestly. The shore component was the piece that turned a harassment action into a potential kill chain. Along the northern coastline of the Strait of Hormuz, positioned in hardened sites that had been under construction and improvement since the Iran-Iraq War, sat batteries of Nor anti-ship cruise missiles. The Nor is Iran's domestic production variant of the Chinese C-802, a sea-skimming weapon with a range of roughly 75 miles, an active radar seeker in the terminal phase, and a warhead large enough to mission-kill a destroyer in a single hit. A carrier would require multiple strikes, but the batteries had the inventory for multiple strikes. The plan called for the speedboat swarm to fix the carrier in place, slow it, distract it, force it into a predictable position, and then the shore batteries would fire a coordinated salvo at a target that could not maneuver out of the way because 52 boats were in the water around it, making maneuver impossible. That was the architecture. Surface chaos enabling precision fires. It was elegant in design and built on a genuine insight about the physical constraints of the Strait of Hormuz. The carrier could not go fast. The carrier could not turn freely. The carrier could not ignore 52 radar contacts closing from multiple bearings. Every assumption in the plan was individually reasonable. The morning was still dark when the Eisenhower entered the strait. The carrier was making 12 knots, which in the confined waters of Hormuz might as well be standing still. Its 2 Arleigh Burke-class escorts had taken up positions forward and to starboard, optimized for exactly the threat the Navy had spent years expecting. An E-2D Hawkeye had launched 90 minutes earlier and was orbiting at 28,000 feet, its radar painting a picture of the entire strait from coast to coast with resolution that could distinguish between a fishing dhow and a rigid-hulled inflatable at 40 miles. An EA-18G Growler had been airborne for even longer, its electronic warfare suite passively mapping every radar emitter on the Iranian coastline, building a real-time catalog of which systems were powered down, which were in standby, and which were warming up for active use. 2 SH-60 Seahawks sat on the forward escorts deck, rotors not yet turning, crews already in the aircraft. The first indication came not from radar, but from the Growler. At 6:04, the crew registered a change in the electromagnetic environment along the northern shore. Several shore-based radar systems that had been in low-power standby mode for weeks began transitioning to higher readiness states. The transitions were subtle, power increases, frequency shifts consistent with pre-engagement calibration, but the Growler systems had been watching these specific emitters long enough to know what normal looked like, and this was not normal. The crew reported the change to the Eisenhower's Combat Information Center without editorial. They did not need to add interpretation. Everyone who heard the report understood what calibrating shore-based targeting radars at 6 in the morning during an American carrier transit meant. At 6:08, the Hawkeye reported surface contacts emerging from the Iranian coastline. Not 1 or 2. The contacts appeared in clusters, first along the coast near Bandar Abbas, then further east near Keshem Island, then from smaller launch points that American intelligence had catalogued but considered secondary. The count moved fast. By 6:10, the Hawkeye was tracking 31 distinct contacts. By 6:12, the number was 44. By 6:14, it had settled at 52, and the formation geometry was unmistakable. The CIC aboard the Eisenhower did not experience this as surprise. It experienced it as recognition. The scenario they were seeing unfold on the tactical display was a scenario they had trained against so many times that the watch team's response was not reactive. It was procedural. Contacts were tagged, classified, and assigned to defensive assets according to a framework that had been established long before anyone in the room had reported for duty that morning. The 2 Seahawks launched. The escorts adjusted positions by pre-planned increments. The Eisenhower itself maintained course and speed, because the worst thing it could do in that channel was deviate from the track that kept it in navigable water. The carrier was going to transit the strait. The boats in the water did not change that calculation. They changed everything else. Here is where the IRGC's planning ran into something it had modeled but not experienced. The plan assumed that 52 simultaneous contacts arriving from multiple bearings at high speed would create a processing bottleneck in the American defensive picture. That assumption was based on older models of how American combat information centers functioned. In those models, human operators were the limiting factor. Each operator could track a finite number of contacts. Each radar system could hold a finite number of tracks in its computer. Each weapon system required a finite period of human decision-making before it could engage. Find the sum of all those finite limits and exceed it, and the defense collapses. That was the theory. The theory had not kept pace with the Cooperative Engagement Capability, which meant that the Eisenhower and both escorts were not three ships with three separate radar pictures trying to coordinate by voice. They were one integrated sensor network with three nodes, each node's radar feeding into a common track picture that updated continuously and was available to every weapon system in the group simultaneously. A contact tracked by the forward escort spy, 1D radar, could be engaged by the aft escort's missiles without the aft escort ever illuminating the target with its own radar. The processing bottleneck the IRGC was trying to create did not exist in the form they had planned for. The bottleneck had been replaced by a system that could maintain individual tracks on well over 100 simultaneous contacts and assign engagement priorities to all of them faster than any human in the loop could articulate a single report. The outer ring of boats hit the expected positions at 6:16 and began their runs. 18 fast hulls fanning out across both flanks of the strike group, engines screaming, throwing spray. They were loud. They were visible. They were exactly where the plan said they would be, and the American system noted every single one of them, classified them as low priority based on range, bearing rate, and weapons probability, and continued devoting the majority of its attention to the formations that mattered. The middle layer began its approach at 6:18. These boats were slower, heavier, and their approach geometry was designed to create overlapping tracks on radar. Boats crossing each other's paths, merging and separating, trying to make the radar picture as cluttered as possible. Against a radar system from the 1990s, this might have been effective. Against the SPY-6 and the track management algorithms running in 2025, it produced nothing except a set of tracks that were slightly more computationally expensive to maintain. The system maintained them without difficulty. At 6:19, standard radio warnings were issued on bridge-to-bridge frequencies in English and Farsi. These were not attempts at communication. They were legal instruments, spoken into a recording system that would preserve them for every investigation and review that would follow. The warnings were calm, clear, and completely ignored. Everyone on both sides expected this. The first Seahawk reached the center cluster at 6:20 and began transmitting video back to CIC. The imagery confirmed what the intelligence assessment had predicted. Several boats in the inner formation were riding low, carrying loads that were not consistent with the machine guns and crew-served weapons visible on the others. Tarps covered forward-mounted objects on at least 3 hulls. The camera resolution was good enough to see the shapes underneath the tarps, and the shapes were consistent with launch rails. The Seahawk pilot reported what she saw without inflection. The weapons officer in CIC logged the report and updated the threat classification on those 3 contacts from probable to confirmed. 6:22. The Growler reported a critical update. 2 of the shore-based nor battery radars had transitioned from calibration to search mode. They were not yet in targeting mode, the distinction being whether the radar was painting the ocean looking for a contact or whether it had locked onto a specific return and was feeding guidance data to a missile on a rail. But the transition from search to targeting could happen in seconds, and the Growler crew began preparing the specific electronic warfare response that would be required if those radars took the next step. The preparation involved the Growler's jamming systems, which were capable of either drowning the radar signal in noise or, more surgically, injecting false targets into the radar's processing chain to confuse the targeting solution. Both options were loaded and ready. The Growler waited. 6:23. The probe came from the starboard side. A single outer ring boat broke its arc pattern and drove inward at maximum speed, cutting across the gap between the outer distraction layer and the middle formation. It was a test. Everyone knew it was a test. The forward escort's response was a burst from the 25mm chain gun, a line of splashes across the water roughly 200 meters ahead of the boat's bow. The boat hauled hard to port, nearly lost control in its own wake, recovered, and returned to the outer ring. The test had produced an answer. The Americans would fire warning shots. The Americans had not yet fired on hulls. That answer went back through the IRGC formation faster than any formal communication network could have carried it. The boat crews saw it. The middle layer crews saw it. The inner cluster saw it. And whatever decision process governed the next phase of the operation interpreted that answer as permission to continue. 6:27. The inner cluster accelerated. All 11 boats surged forward simultaneously, driving for the corridor between the Eisenhower's bow and the forward escort. The approach speed was above 40 knots. At that speed, the distance between the inner cluster's position and the carrier's hull would be covered in less than 3 minutes. The middle layer surged with them, not toward the carrier but laterally, trying to pull defensive fire away from the center. The outer ring increased its tempo on both flanks. Every element of the plan activated at the same moment, and for approximately 15 seconds, the tactical picture looked exactly the way the IRGC planners had wanted it to look: dense, fast, converging from multiple angles, and demanding simultaneous responses from every American defensive asset. The 15 seconds ended when the system responded. The forward escort engaged the lead boat in the center cluster with direct fire. The shot was not a warning. The 5-inch gun put a round into the hull forward of the engine compartment, and the boat came apart in a way that suggested the warhead packed into its bow contributed to the violence of the destruction. The second boat took fire from the Seahawk, which had repositioned to cover the corridor and was now engaging from a hover at an altitude and angle that gave its door gunner a clear line on every boat in the inner formation. The third boat found its approach lane closed by the forward escort, which had moved to a position that the tactical picture had identified as optimal 4 minutes before the inner cluster began its run. The movement had not been reactive. It had been anticipatory. The fourth and fifth boats in the center cluster reached the decision point where their crews had to commit to the final approach or turn away. The fourth committed. The SeaRAM launcher on the forward escort engaged it with a rolling airframe missile at close range, and the detonation was close enough to the other inner cluster boats that 2 of them veered off course from the blast pressure alone. The fifth turned. It turned hard enough that its port gunnel dipped below the waterline and the boat nearly swamped before its crew recovered control and drove north. The 3 boats with the confirmed missile launch rails never got to fire. One was hit by the second Seahawk, which had been holding in reserve for exactly this contingency. The missile struck the boat amidships and the secondary explosion from the C-701 propellant was bright enough to be seen from the Eisenhower's flight deck with the naked eye. The second missile-armed boat was engaged by the aft escort, which had maintained a fire solution on it through the Cooperative Engagement Capability without ever directly tracking it with its own radar. The third missile boat saw the other 2 explode within 8 seconds of each other and turned away. Its crew chose survival. No one who studies this engagement afterward criticizes that decision. The shore batteries entered the story at 6:29 and exited it at 6:30. The transition from search to targeting mode on the 2 NOR battery radars that the Growler had been monitoring lasted approximately 40 seconds. During those 40 seconds, the Growler executed a jamming sequence that did not simply overpower the radar signal. It corrupted it. The technique is classified in its specifics but understood in its principles. The jammer takes the radar's own signal, modifies it, and returns it in a way that makes the radar's processing system generate false targets, false ranges, and false bearing data. The radar believes it is working correctly. The operators see a picture that looks coherent. But the picture is wrong, and any missile fired using that picture will guide on a target that does not exist at the location the radar is reporting. The shore battery operators saw the corruption in their data within seconds. They recognized it for what it was. They shut down the radars rather than fire blind. The Growler crew noted the shutdown and continued orbiting. The shore batteries did not reactivate for the remainder of the transit. Without the shore component, the speedboat attack was a limb without a body. The boats were never going to sink the carrier alone. They were the delivery mechanism for a missile strike that never materialized. The remaining boats in the water knew this in the way that soldiers in a failed operation always know, not because someone tells them, but because the tempo changes, the coordination dissolves, and the actions that were supposed to follow the actions they are taking do not appear. Between 6:30 and 6:38, the engagement entered its final phase. The middle layer boats, having absorbed the defensive fire they were designed to absorb, began withdrawing in disorganized groups. Several were too damaged to maintain speed and were taken under tow by other boats. Others simply turned north and drove for the coast without attempting to maintain formation. The outer ring, which had never been engaged directly, held its positions longer than anyone else, as if waiting for a second phase that was never coming. When the last of the middle layer boats cleared the area, the outer ring followed. The final group to withdraw was a reserve element of 9 boats that had held at the periphery of the engagement zone throughout. They had been positioned to exploit whatever gap the initial assault created. No gap had been created. They had watched the entire operation unfold on their radar and their radios, and the picture they assembled from those inputs left them with no viable course of action except the one they eventually took. They turned north in a loose column at 6:38 and made for port at moderate speed, not running, not lingering. Leaving, the Eisenhower CIC logged the end of organized resistance at 6:41. The tactical picture still showed contacts in the water, debris, disabled hulls drifting with the current, a few boats making slow headway north trailing smoke, but nothing that represented a coordinated threat. The carrier had maintained 12 knots throughout. It had not altered course. It had not deviated from the center of the navigable channel. Both escorts were undamaged. Both Seahawks were recovering aboard. The Growler was still orbiting, still watching the shore, still ready. 21 Iranian boats were confirmed destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. 14 were damaged and withdrawing under their own power or under tow. 17 withdrew without significant damage. The human cost on the Iranian side has never been officially confirmed and probably never will be. The American side reported 0 casualties. 0 damage to any vessel. 0 weapons expended that were not accounted for in the pre-transit defensive loadout. The Eisenhower cleared the eastern end of the Strait of Hormuz at 6:44 and entered the Gulf of Oman with open water ahead and a threat picture that was empty for the first time in 40 minutes. There is a temptation to interpret this as a story about American superiority, and on one level it is that. The defensive performance was exceptional. The integration of sensors, weapons, electronic warfare, and decision-making across multiple platforms produced a result that the IRGC's plan was specifically designed to prevent. Every layer of the Iranian architecture was defeated by a corresponding American capability that had been positioned, rehearsed, and executed with a kind of precision that only comes from having thought about a problem for as long as the other side has been creating it. But the more interesting reading is about the nature of the competition itself. The IRGC did not send 52 boats into the strait because it misunderstood the risk. It sent them because the strategic logic of its position in the Persian Gulf demands that it be willing to test the American defensive system periodically, probing for the gap that doctrine says must exist, because no system is perfect and no defensive network covers every angle simultaneously in every condition forever. The IRGC is correct about that. No system is perfect. The American defensive network that performed flawlessly on this particular morning, against this particular attack, in these particular conditions, is not guaranteed to perform identically the next time. Different weather, different equipment readiness state, different crew fatigue levels, a radar that is down for maintenance, a software update that introduces a glitch that takes 20 seconds to override. The margins in a close-range naval engagement in confined waters are small enough that any one of those variables could change the outcome. The IRGC knows this. The IRGC is built around knowing this. The 52 boats that burned or withdrew on this morning will be analyzed, replaced, and improved. The doctrine will be updated. The coordination will be tightened. The shore batteries will receive new radar systems with better electronic countermeasure capabilities. The C-701 missiles on the inner ring boats will be replaced by something faster and harder to intercept. And in a year or 2 years or 5 years, another morning will come when the strait is narrow and the carrier is slow and the boats are in the water again. The American side knows this too. That is why the Growler was already orbiting before sunrise. That is why the Hawkeye was airborne 90 minutes early. That is why the escorts took their positions without being told, and the Seahawk crews were in their aircraft before the first contact appeared on radar. The defense that held on this morning was not assembled in response to the attack. It was assembled in anticipation of an attack that everyone involved had known was coming for years. The only unknown was the date. The Strait of Hormuz at midday, 8 hours after the engagement, looked the way it always looks. Tanker traffic moved through the shipping lanes in both directions. Fishing boats worked the shallows near the islands. The water was flat, gray-green, and empty of anything that suggested violence had occurred on it that morning. The debris had scattered. The oil from ruptured fuel tanks had dispersed into the current. The bodies that had not been recovered had gone where the Gulf always takes them. The Eisenhower was 200 miles into the Gulf of Oman by then, making turns for 18 knots, the strait behind it and open ocean ahead. Its flight deck was already cycling aircraft for the next mission, whatever the next mission was going to be. The transit was logged, catalogued, and filed alongside every other transit the Navy had conducted through Hormuz since 1979. It was one line in a very long ledger. The IRGC flotilla's surviving boats were back in port at Bandar Abbas. Crews were being debriefed. Damage was being assessed. Somewhere in a building that American satellites photograph regularly but cannot see inside, someone was already writing the first draft of the report that would become the next plan. The strait did not care. It never does. It sits between two coastlines that have been arguing for as long as anyone can remember, and it moves ships through regardless of who is arguing about what, and it will be there long after every boat that has ever floated on it is gone. The next carrier will come through. The next boats will be in the water. The question is never whether. The question is always when, and whether the margins hold. On this morning, they held.